Hello! So we have made it to the bitter end of The Rings of Power. The Rings of Power as a series was ultimately a failure in terms of storytelling, amongst many other things. So what went wrong? Simon Tolkien's revenge is real, and yes, I stole that from George the Giant Slayer, because that is funny as hell. The Rings of Power, when it was first announced, was announced as this faithful adaptation of the Second Age of Tolkien. They were very unclear with everything, the information that happened, and even the information of what they had the rights to. There were a lot of articles in the early days saying they were adapting the Silmarillion, which they didn't do because they didn't have the rights to it. They adapted the appendices of the Lord of the Rings. The problem with that is that is missing some characters and important ones. Then it was announced the budget, the most expensive television series ever made. And when I first heard this news and all the information and Tom Shippey's involvement and Christopher Tolkien's involvement, I was applauding it in those early videos. You can go back on my channel a few years and find them. Ultimately, that didn't happen, and they didn't create a faithful adaptation of Tolkien's Second Age. They created a Game of Thrones style fantasy using Middle-earth and character names from Tolkien's work. Ultimately, that's the problem, but we're going to break it down. What went wrong? Why has it failed in terms of just structure and creativity? At the moment, Season 2 is in pre-production, and ultimately, when Season 2 eventually comes out over a year from now, will people even care? That's a thing. Like Star Trek Discovery, if you look at those numbers and viewership of that series, it's shockingly low and it exists purely to be content for a streaming service. And I think that's the fate of this. So where did the failure start? Behind the scenes a lot happened. Because they didn't have the rights to certain character names and certain moments and key events, they wrote their own. They created characters to fill the gaps where they didn't have the rights to do it. Then, even before the series premiered, before there was any casting or information, they went on the defensive with fans. They even attacked Tolkien himself. Then you go into the production, they fired Tom Shippey for an apparent interview which was it was just a discussion of lore. That was all it was. They wanted him gone because he was the one holding them back after Christopher Tolkien's death. They also blamed the Tolkien estate. But when Christopher Tolkien died, that was the first red flag. Rumoured behind the scenes stuff involved firing of many people, getting rid of anyone that disagreed with them, and then bringing in some purple-haired SJW that was about gender equality and social studies, which I don't think she ever read The Lord of the Rings, not in the way it should be read if she did. They created this series where they compressed the timeline, a story that takes place over thousands of years, and bulk of the story they're using takes place over about 1800, but the Second Age is massive. And then they rewrote characters. For example, and the weakest link of the show is Galadriel, or Gailadriel, quoting Nerdrotic. They created her as a character where she bears no resemblance to anything Galadriel ever did in any written text. Tolkien himself described her as an Amazon, but Amazon means strong in that context, not as a warrior with a sword, and I'm sure she was in a few battles, but she's definitely the magic user. They made her angry, they got rid of her husband, they took away her own agency within the story and swapped a lot of her story with Elrond. A lot of the events and a lot of the stuff that seems to happen is more his story than hers. But in this day and age of television, you can't have a strong female character on TV who isn't angry. Then we go into other stuff that's happened. All of these actors are on really low pay. That's another red flag, like Actors Union minimum pay on a $1 billion TV show. The most well-known person in this entire thing is Lenny Henry. The insertion of hobbits, half-foots, within the Second Age as a proto-hobbit is also incorrect. There are 3 types of hobbits. And yes, Tolkien himself said they didn't do anything important in the Second Age. But there is no record of hobbits within this era. There is nothing. Why make up a hobbit story if you are only doing it to emulate the Fellowship of the Ring? This show feels like they emulated plot points and story beats from the Peter Jackson trilogy, predominantly the Fellowship, and then they've come into it with other key plot points and even characterization that belongs in Game of Thrones. There's a lot of similarity between this and some plot points of season 1 and 2 of Game of Thrones, which is also a weird move. They never wanted to create Lord of the Rings, they wanted to create a Game of the Thrones-esque show, socio-political fantasy, which doesn't really work in Tolkien's high fantasy world. Then we come into the actual production. You have gorgeous scenery, and I will say this, I'll give credit where credit's due. The scenery in this series can be spectacular, be it the real shooting in New Zealand to the CGI shots that they used. Now they've moved production to the UK, partly to get away from New Zealand's struggling film industry and its fees. But then the CGI and special effects are predominantly inconsistent. When you look at the visuals, CGI wolves, some of the villains, some of the other stuff, even the Balrog looked kind of weird, and I'm surprised how close a lot of the CGI is to Peter Jackson's trilogy, or more or less straight from it. The sets feel very small. You have these beautiful big scenery with thousands of CGI people walking around, yet when you cut to the actors, the sets are small and closed in, and a lot of the extras are just repeated over and over again. You have inconsistencies in storytelling, a show that does not know its own structure or its own script. 5 ships but there's only 3 on screen. Inconsistent to the point of ridiculousness. Galadriel jumping off a boat and swimming the equivalent of the Atlantic Ocean. This character is older than the moon, and her characterization here is not related to Galadriel of the Second Age at all. She also wasn't at some of these events. They're going to tell the fall of Numenor, I'm sure of it, and I'm surprised they didn't just do that if they wanted a socio-political fantasy, but that's a whole different discussion. Costumes. The costumes of this show are really inconsistent. There's actually some nice pieces set against some terrible pieces. A lot of the costumes look so cheap. Armour is very obviously plastic, often not fitting the actors properly, and the weaponry seems to have no weight to it or bulk. There's no, Shadversity was talking about that in many of his videos. There's no weight to this weaponry, and the fighting and wirework looks more Hidden Dragon than anything else. Then we break down the storytelling. The storytelling of this show was bizarre at best. Everything just happens. There's no build-up. There's no sense of time. They obviously re-edited things and shot things out of order to the point that actors would appear in some scenes wearing the same costumes and on the same sets from previous episodes. To the point it was almost laughable. This show has no sense of time, no sense of progression. They did the creation of... They did Mount Doom, of all places, but again, yes, that partly is lifted from Tolkien, but the insertion of characters that didn't need to be there seems very odd. And with the timeline of this, they've set this toward, I'm presuming, the end of the Second Age, with the fall of Numenor and some of the characters there. A lot of these characters would never have met. They're separated by centuries. The writing is also another element of this series which is bad. The writing choices they've made for this entire show have not only felt lazy, but they're almost too fan-servicey in many ways. They put a reference to the Peter Jackson films. They borrow lines directly from those films constantly. They've changed the meanings of certain songs and certain moments and certain little things throughout. They've taken the series, they've taken this work, and obliterated it into something that it's not. The second they said, "We've written the book Tolkien never wrote," was when fans started waving their red flags. And I also think they underestimated the fans. And I've said this many times in other videos, that Tolkien fans are not like the vacuous Disney Star Wars fans who will take anything and scream how gorgeous it is and how brilliant it is because Obi-Wan Kenobi says, "Well, hello there." Lord of the Rings fans are scholars, intellectuals, geeks, gamers. They are people that are predominantly very educated, and many of them have spent their lives studying Tolkien's work. They also underestimated that Tolkien's influence within the fantasy genre is pretty much it. Tolkien was the backbone of fantasy alongside Robert E. Howard, two different genres of fantasy created roughly, not quite the same time, but there's enough closeness there. Two writers who are so important to fantasy that it almost feels like they don't care. And the blatant disregard for Tolkien's work is something that got a lot of fans' backs up too. When they created this series, they had no intention of ever creating Tolkien's work. They wanted to tell their own story and just use the name to try and buy Tolkien fans, to buy the people that read the books, and even the casual normies that have seen the films a few times. They underestimated the fact that now the normies, the people who maybe watch the films once or twice, are turning their backs on this show. And when I see people defending it, they always talk about the same things. It's visually stunning. No offence, but there are some better looking TV shows. They also tried to push the narrative that any criticism of this show was to do with race. And that narrative was completely proven wrong by The House of the Dragon. A brilliant TV show, a prequel to Game of Thrones, that actually is well written, with great characters and story. And why I disagree with race swapping characters, I think they did a good job. Ultimately, Game of Thrones was doomed to... Ultimately, The Rings of Power was doomed to fail. It was doomed to sit at the bottom of mediocrity. Everyone involved in this show is almost a nobody, and JJ Twattenham's, as I call him, Bad Robot, that involvement alone is a red flag. This is the company... JJ can't create, he destroys, and you've seen it with countless franchises, Star Trek, Star Wars, and so on. The only reason these showrunners got this job was him. Two people with no real credits behind them. No real filmography, no real work. And like I said, they hired actors that people were not overly familiar with. The most well-known person to a UK audience there is Lenny Henry, but he's more known as Dawn French's husband, a TV host and comedian, and I use that word loosely because I don't find him funny at all. This series also created this weird narrative on social media with the paid shills and paid promotion. The super fans that have not watched it, not mentioned it, and never mentioned Lord of the Rings in any of their content. It's very obvious that a lot of the superfan video was just multiple takes chopped together. You could see it, it was scripted. They put all this money into promotion and paying people. The amount of bots that are around that are shilling for this TV series. And people who scream about Amazon being an evil corporation but are supporting Rings of Power, even though Amazon use sweatshops and destroy people. Literally. The problem is you cannot have one without the other in terms of corporation. An abusive work environment and horrible work environment. I know people that have worked in those warehouses. Yet they are screaming at the top of their lungs that if you don't like Rings of Power, you are a racist, you are a misogynist, you are this, you are that. The idea that the people enjoying the show can't enjoy it because people are criticising it is also a sign of just how shallow they are. There's no depth to these people. How dare you don't like the show? How dare you don't enjoy it? Because if you don't like it, how am I supposed to enjoy it? There is a sense of narcissism to them. Every article to do with this series has been about race or gender. It's been virtue signalling. It's never been anything else. This is the sad state of modern television, and when you see people screaming that things need to be changed for modernity, and the misconception that Tolkien is a racist, not only fills me with sadness, it kind of just destroys any work. It destroys this legacy, and I think that was ultimately one of the goals, to separate Tolkien from the Lord of the Rings, and to separate him from his work. Bringing Simon Tolkien on, a failed crime writer, and I've read his books, he's not a good writer at all, who doesn't like the Peter Jackson movies. And that brings me into Peter Jackson. To ghost Peter Jackson was a ridiculous thing to do. I feel like the Wheel of Time series should have been a red flag, and as much as I'm not a fan of the Wheel of Time books, I can accept that they are also a backbone of fantasy, especially of that era, and their influence, which you can see from the Lord of the Rings, and their influence, Wheel of Time books, come down into books that came after. When you see this, I'm amazed now in hindsight, I'm amazed people were screaming, oh, it's just a book, we need to change it. No. Tolkien didn't like allegory. Tolkien didn't like anything to do with that. He was also very selective on how his work was adapted and how it was handled. And the second Christopher Tolkien died, that was the final coffin nail for this series, really. They got rid of everyone that didn't agree with them. They've broken the Lord of the Rings canon, to the point now that the Lord of the Rings books the stories can't happen within this weird Amazon universe. And this is also a thing. I think people are sick of their things that they love being obliterated for the sake of modernity. Star Trek, for example. Star Trek Discovery is a terrible series that broke canon, that broke everything. And again, that was a coffin nail, and its viewership is low. Jodie's take on Doctor Who, it wasn't the fact that it's a woman playing the Doctor, it was a fact that they've broken the canon that they built of Doctor Who as a Time Lord. Now he, she, whatever, is the timeless child. These companies don't care about you. They virtue signal and pretend they do, but instead they literally just see you as a cash cow. And it's kind of weird. There was no love, there was no passion to these ones. There was no... You watch the Peter Jackson movies, and yes, they did change things, and did give actors a bit more oomph, and did tweak some stuff here and there. But I accept changes for the sake of storytelling. I accept that book and film are two different mediums. The problem is here, they didn't care about any of that. It is not a faithful adaptation of Tolkien's work. It is not respectful of the lore of the world. It is an original story set with it's basically that. An original story set with a Lord of the Rings skin. This series should never have happened, and it's a tragedy that it did. The good that has come out of it, though, is that people have picked up Tolkien's work. People are reading his work again, and they're not just reading The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings, they're going into his other works. The Silmarillion, The Unfinished Tales, The Lost Tales, and countless other books and short stories and letters and poems that he wrote. He was a phenomenal writer. His translation of Beowulf is second to none. The Fall of Arthur is another book that's also worth reading. The good that has come out of it is that people are more savvy of the game that these corporations have been playing, and it did start with 2016's Ghostbusters, and actually Disney with Star Wars as well. They're more savvy of it, they see through it, and the fact that these people are now picking up these great works, these tomes, listening to them, reading them, whatever, is spectacular. And it's also left a lot of very die-hard fans, including myself, sad. This show should be the benchmark of fantasy. It should be... Tolkien is the benchmark. And yet, this series has fallen by the wayside and become what it is. It's content for a streaming service. Heartless, soulless, cash in. The original Lord of the Rings films were a massive risk for the studio, and everything that came after, and the fallout, and the whole mess of poor Peter Jackson, really goes to show that it is just hollow sometimes. And this series is a prime example of a shameless hollow cash-in. A series that doesn't care about you as an audience, doesn't want you as an audience, and doesn't know who it's for, by a bunch of nobodies that don't care. At the end of the day, The Rings of Power is what it is. A mediocre television show, one of the worst I've seen in years, that's soulless and empty, created by soulless and empty people. So tell me what you think in the comments below. I'm really curious on your opinions and everything that's happened, and I hope you guys stick around for my long non-Lord of the Rings content, because I know some of you will leave when this ends. But for those who stick around and like my content, thank you, and those who have watched all of my Rings of Power stuff, thank you. You don't realise what it means to me. So I will leave you here, and I will see you in my next video.